So, it's kind of been a kind of a funky weather week, right? About a foot of snow on Friday, but it was like 60 on Wednesday, And it was kind of funny because I was thinking that those of you know where we live, Bonnie and I live over on Parade Ground, or actually Parade Ground Cemetery Road, right? Which is kind of like the longest street name ever, it seems. I know. And it's a dirt road. And one of the things we see in the summertime a lot is people go running on that road. And so I was thinking on Tuesday that if, on Tuesday I think it was in the 50s, if I'd kind of walk down my driveway, and imagine if I kind of looked down the dirt road kind of towards 103 where it kind of comes uphill, I saw somebody running towards me. And it'd be like, well, we don't usually see runners in February, but, it's kind of spring weather, so maybe somebody's out running. But I imagined if I saw the person running towards me, and they were clearly kind of lumbering, kind of struggling to get up to me, and as I get closer, I realize that with every step, they're limping a bit. And so, and I have a very vivid imagination, so ride along with me on this, is that I said, hey, I notice you're limping. What's going on? And he kind of runs up to me, and he does that thing runners do where they kind of keep moving, but they're standing next to you sort of thing. And I noticed that every time his feet hit the ground, he kind of winces a little bit. He just keeps doing it over and over again. And I say, hey, are you okay? He seems like you're hurting. He goes, yeah, I'm fine. Why? I'm like, well, I can't help but notice that every time your feet hit the ground, you kind of limp and make a face. He goes, oh, it's not a big deal. I have some stones in my shoe. And I'm like, well, don't you want to dump those stones out? He goes, no, I figured that if I just keep pushing through, eventually it'll stop hurting and I'll be fine. Now, that would seem like a kind of ridiculous thing for someone to do. But I wonder how often we do that sort of thing. How often do we have pain? And we're convinced that the thing to do is keep pushing through it, that by pushing through it, I'll get better. So now remember that we're actually in a series that we started a couple weeks ago, which is our More Than Meets the Eye. Right? And our focus throughout this series is this common idea that many of us, if not most of us, are probably not really living completely the life that we wanted. They may be small things, there just may have been something that was really important to you when you were younger that you thought you would have a chance to get to do, and you just didn't, and you've just kind of grown to accept that that's just the way it has to be. Or maybe there were big things you wanted to achieve. There was a profession you wanted to go into, or there's some place you wanted to live, or those sort of things, and it didn't really come together. Life feels like it's fallen short, and we feel like it's too late now. Or maybe you feel like you're living someone else's life, that, either due to parental pressure or family pressure or social pressure or just misguided pressure on ourselves. We find a point in time where we're living a life that doesn't even feel like our own. It feels like it belongs to someone else. I'm living this facade that must be someone else's life because this can't be my life. And we often feel like there's no other choice. But remember that when we kicked off the series, we kind of laid that out in kind of much more detail. And we said that although that is a very real emotion, that is a very real feeling, it is very real for many of us, again, if not most of us. Jesus tells us that he came to bring something else. So he came to bring us life. And we so often focus on this idea of eternal life that comes through Jesus. And yes, that is really important, and that's what we focus on very much in our faith, that we believe that we get eternal life through faith. It is a gift. There is nothing we do to earn it. But as we looked at what Jesus says about, I'm here to bring you a life that is full, as we examined the phrasing he uses in that, it wasn't just about eternal life. It was about the life that we live here. That our eternal life is somehow driven in a way by how we live here. That when we die and we go to heaven, right, we don't become someone else. Apostle Paul is very clear that we are ourselves. So somehow, what we do in this life is important in this life, but important beyond this life, even if we don't understand all the details of that. But I would argue that even if we didn't believe in eternal life, and maybe you're someone who's not really sure about this Jesus thing or this religion thing, and maybe you don't believe in eternal life, I am still convinced that there is a way to live our lives today that is better and more full than I think that many of us have grown to accept. And there are a lot of things that get in the way of doing that. There's a lot of things that hold us back. And throughout this series, we're looking at various things that play into that, to actually make that the case. And the one I want to talk about today, I think, is maybe the one that may be most common among us. I think that most of us are playing hurt. You know, if you think of an athlete that gets injured, right, or a track star who gets hurt, they go into the race. And, you know, they're professional athletes. They can push themselves more than most people can, but they're not going to perform at their ability because they're hurt. Well, I think most of us are hurt. And I think most of us are very much like the runner in my story, where the runner in my story has stones in his shoes and his feet are hurting, but he believes if I just keep pushing through, eventually those stones won't hurt. Or to kind of beat that metaphor to death, he almost believes that somehow the stones will just disappear if he just keeps running. I think that many of us are dealing with emotional scars, an emotional hurt, an emotional pain, that we are convinced the thing to do is just to keep running, just keep running. And if I run through hard enough and long enough, maybe it won't hurt anymore. Maybe it'll disappear. But what would we tell that runner to do? We'd say, stop and dump those stones out of your shoe. And then you can run better. I think that we need to consider that same idea. Now, the title of the message is kind of odd, you know, playing hurt. You know, as you guys know, I'm a big NFL fan. So I like sports metaphors where I can. Good sports metaphors, not baseball ones, you know, football ones, sort of thing. But, you know, the cool thing about sports metaphors is that sports are very pervasive in American society. That you don't have to be a big sports person to understand the basics. Right? If someone comes out of a meeting and they're like, man, I hit a home run. Well, you know the meeting went well. Right? Or if someone's in an argument with their spouse and they come back and meet up with their friends, you go, you know what? I just decided to punt. In other words, I just stopped fighting. I gave up. Just give her what she wants, sort of thing. And the neat thing about sports metaphors is that they paint a picture. Right? Saying that the meeting went well is one thing. Saying I hit a home run is another thing, right? It actually paints that picture so much more clearly. And the neat thing about sports metaphors is that because they paint a picture in a few words, they allow us to convey information more effectively, and they allow us to create an emotional experience as we kind of go through something where it's not just the facts, it's a feeling. And it's interesting is that this idea of using sports metaphor is not a 20th century invention. It has actually been around for a very, very long time. In fact, we know that the Apostle Paul in the first century commonly used sports metaphors, that there are actually sports metaphors in the New Testament. And basically, the one we're going to look at today actually comes from a letter that he wrote to a church located in a Greek city called Corinth. We generally know the books as Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And what's interesting is that Corinth was a huge sports destination. That actually every year in the city of Corinth, they would have this big festival with lots of music and two big sporting events. There was a track event and there was a boxing event. And so as Paul is writing these people this letter, the people in this church a letter, he's writing them a letter about living life well. And as he does that, he uses sports metaphors. In fact, what the Apostle Paul writes is, All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away. But we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I'm not just shadowboxing. So he actually uses these sports metaphors around sports that they understand. Now, he's kind of mixing his metaphors. He's mixing a running metaphor with a boxing metaphor. But, if I said, I didn't know if I was going to hit a home run or if I was going to have to punt, right, I'd be mixing those metaphors, but it would still be meaningful. It would still relate the information. And the thing that he wants to make really clear here is that living our lives well is like running a marathon. That it is a long run, it is a long race. And so if we're going to do it well, we've got to do what those athletes do. Those athletes, in order to be successful, they're disciplined. So Paul is saying that if we want to live our lives well, we have to be disciplined. And we have to realize that we're actually working towards a purpose throughout our whole lives. Because I think a mistake that we can easily make, and I'll admit this is a mistake that I made for much of my life, is I always thought the idea of having purpose or having success was a destination. That I was going to try to get to that place where I am successful, or I am purposeful, or I am important, or maybe I can just live with myself. And the point that Paul is making is that, no, man, you find purpose in every step. That's a fulfilling life. That if your focus is always in that thing down there somewhere, that's not going to be a satisfying life. It's about being purposeful throughout the entire journey. And so a life that is well lived is purposeful in every step. But ideally, each little step of purpose is building towards a bigger purpose. But you don't forsake the steps along the way as you get there. And so I think we would all agree that pursuing a life of purpose, again, whether you're a Jesus follower or not, a life that is purposeful is more engaging, is more meaningful. But if you're a Jesus follower, it's much deeper than that. That basically we believe that if you put your faith in Jesus, that our life has eternal consequences, an eternal outcome. And one of the things that Paul wanted to make clear is that, he says that they do it to win a prize that will fade away. We do it for an eternal prize. Do you know what the winner of the big track race got? One of those funky little leaf crowns. That's what he was running for, which could look really good on the day he wins. What's it look like next Tuesday after laying in the sun? You know what it's made of in many cases? Herbs or pines, commonly even celery leaves. I don't know what celery leaves look like after the Greek sun for a week, but I don't imagine very good. And so he's saying that, look at what they're doing. Look how hard they're working for something that passes away. And we've got something that's eternal. So he's really encouraging us to be disciplined. And he kind of really drives the point home with the way he brackets the statement. He says, he starts out with all athletes are disciplined in their training. And he closes with, I'm not just shadowboxing. That the steps matter. The things we do matter. But now the thing that's interesting is that if we look at what an athlete does, a successful athlete does, when we talk about an athlete being disciplined, it's not just the way they actually run. Right? If an athlete was to sit down and eat junk food, watch TV all day, whatever else he might do, not sleep enough, when he shows up on race day, he's not going to win. Right? So part of the discipline is realizing the things that he has to do. Right? That the one who wins is the one who trains hard, eats well, but also the one who rests well. Because if we think about what a good athlete does, they may train really hard, but they also make it a point not to burn themselves out. That they actually balance their training with proper rest. And if they get injured, if they get hurt, they deal with it. They tend the hurt. If they need to, they get professional help to deal with the hurt. And they take the time to heal. And I think that's something that we can so easily miss, that as we're going through our lives, we may have times, in fact, we often will have times where we get very focused on disciplined in the sense of working hard, of pushing forward, of doing things that are meaningful. But the thing we miss is rest. That a good athlete balances hard work and rest. A life well lived balances hard work and rest. And just like the athlete, when we're hurting, we need healing. And we have to give ourselves time to heal. We need to balance what we're pursuing with work, rest, and healing. Now, the thing is that as we deal with the hurts inside of us, or identify the hurts inside of us, and I think a very real challenge can be not even knowing what the hurt inside of us is. You know, there's this term in psychology which is free-floating anxiety. I'm just freaking out, and I don't even know why. It happens so often, it actually has a title, that I'm just anxious, and I'm tense, and I don't even know why it's happening. And it's not uncommon. And so I think that one of the things that's key to living our lives well is knowing what our hurts are. And that could be a hard thing to do. And if we want to get a sense of what our hurts are, I mean, where's a good place to start? And there's a lot of ways you can do that. I mean, definitely, I want to encourage people to see counselors when you need to. If you see therapists if you need to, please do those things. But oftentimes, we're just trying to figure out what's going on. And I think that we get a bit of a picture on how we can start to understand what's going on based on what we talked about last week. That we live in a very tense time, a very anxious time. We live in a very busy time. Arguably, kind of the busiest time in human history. And you're part of it, which means you have to live with it and live in it. And what we find is because we're so busy all the time, that we spend much of our lives distracted. You know, with smartphones all the time, podcasts all the time, listening to music all the time, listening to the news all the time, having TV on all the time, social media, hopefully not all the time, but unfortunately all the time, many times. Those things distract us. They pull us out of our lives. But we saw last week there was something super simple we could do that start to change that. But basically, we looked at the fact that there's research that shows that simply taking 5 minutes a day to be intentionally quiet, to have time where there is no noise, no podcasts, no music, no news, and if you could be by yourself, maybe outside in the woods, maybe taking a walk on the sidewalk, or maybe just sitting in your living room, looking out the window. We saw that there were very real benefits that come from that. That we start to realize that things like the physical signs of stress start to diminish, which helps take our stress away a bit. That it quiets that noise in our head. And so we start to worry less. And we start to experience regret less. Just by taking 5 minutes of quiet every day. It's my hope that you gave that a shot for 5 days this week. Because it does make a difference. And the thing that we saw too is that it starts this healthy cycle. That as we initially make ourselves be quiet for 5 minutes, we make ourselves be present in that window of time, we know that we actually start to enjoy it more. We actually enjoy being present more when we're willing to be present. So we can actually be with ourselves more, which is sometimes someone very hard to be with. And we also start to get better at relationships. We get better at being around one another. And through that process that starts with a simple idea of quietness and presence, intentional presence for 5 minutes that cycle of changes starts to bring clarity. We start to develop a clear-headedness. And that has two really important impacts. One is we start to see the world around us more clearly, but also we start to see ourselves more clearly. And it gives us a chance to actually really take a look at ourselves in an honest way. And I think oftentimes the hardest person in the world to be honest with is yourself. And so as we look at this idea of trying to examine ourselves a little bit, we don't want to do that in a harsh way. We simply want to do it in an honest, objective way. This is not about putting ourselves down. It's the exact opposite of that. Because so often, when we look at ourselves, what we see are the things we're not happy with. But there should be tons of things about yourself that you're very happy with. Concentrate on those as well as those things that you want to try to improve a little bit. And as we do that, and we take the time to see ourselves more clearly, I believe we'll get a greater sense of what's driving that hurt inside of us. Because we all have scars, and I think many of us still have very active wounds that we start to see and we start to understand when we take that time to be quiet and look at ourselves. But again, I think that our natural reaction as we see those things is to kind of go back and be like the runner in my story and just convince ourselves that, no, man, I'm pushing it down. If I say it doesn't exist, it doesn't exist. And meanwhile, we're running with stones in our shoes and we're trying to push on. And the thing is that in life, we don't just one stone in our shoe. Right? We get lots of stones in our shoes. And the thing is that if we never dump them out, you still got that stone when you were 6 years old in your shoe when you're 40 years old or 60 years old or 80 years old. But you also picked up a whole bunch of more stones with it. And as you do that, those wounds start to build up and they start to compound one another and things get more hurt. And if we just keep pushing on and just keep pushing it down, there is no way that we're living our lives at the fullest. We've got too much pain. We've got too much hurt. So if we want to live our lives in a way that helps us to live as fully as we are capable of, because I am certain that you were created by God to do things that no one else can do. No one will do the things you do like you will do them. And that will touch lives that only you can touch. But we've got to take care of our own hurt and our own healing along the way. So we've got to be willing to give ourselves the same advice that we would give the runner. I know you want to keep going. I know you want to keep pushing on. I know you're afraid of what that wound looks like at this point. But we would tell him to sit down. Take your shoes off. Dump those stones out. And don't just put the shoes back on and start running again. At this point, those wounds are infected. And that means that every other hurt you have is multiplied by the hurt you already have. So take the time to clean it up, to heal. And again, if you need professional help, get it. Now, as we say all that, it's going to have an impact. In fact, Paul drives that point home actually in another letter he writes where he again uses this metaphor of running. He actually goes on to say, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. So I think one of the most important things he says is that last thing he said, and the point I was just making. That you were created by God for a purpose, and you are uniquely you. So we need to be willing to live that out fully, and we run with endurance. The race is long, so we need to make choices that let us go along the race as it is long. But then, as part of what he says there, he uses a word that we often cringe at, the S word, the sin word. Because we all know what a sin is. It's a very specific list on a wall somewhere of all the things you're not supposed to do. You know, and so as you hear this, you're like, oh man, Paul, what's on your list, man? But we know that that's not how Jesus describes sin. Jesus describes sin as a very simple concept. Anything we do that hurts someone, that's sin. And Paul describes it in a very similar way. Anything that hurts someone. Well, here's the thing. You're a someone. And so when he says strip away the sin that slows us down, part of what he's talking about there, what are the things that are in your life that are hurting you? And the point is, you know, we don't stop doing it because it's wrong, because it's on a list somewhere. It's because it's hurting you. And those hurts, many of those hurts are self-inflicted. Not all of them by any stretch. Right? Hurts come from a lot of different places. But the ones we can control are the ones we're doing to ourselves. So Paul's point here is that if we're going to live well, we've got to strip away these things. Just like this idea of this race, this metaphor of, man, those things are just constantly slowing you down. So do the work to be free of them, whatever they might be for you. Because I know that some of us have incredibly painful hurts. You know, there are memories that are too hard to face. Maybe been part of a toxic relationship, an abusive relationship. Chemical dependencies control so much of our lives. For whatever reason, we've developed self-destructive behaviors where we literally hurt ourselves. And I got to think a boatload of us got trauma from childhood that we don't even talk about. And those things weigh us down. So as I prepare to wrap up, the key thing that I want us to see, I want us to understand, is that many of us are carrying hurts that are deep emotional pain. And deep emotional pain requires deep emotional healing. It takes an effort, it takes time, it takes purpose. It has to be done on purpose. And I know that for many of us, the thought of facing those things is terrifying, But one of the things that Paul wants us to know is that we are not alone. Because as Paul continues that statement, as he talks about running with endurance, he says, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. What Paul wants us to know is that as we do this, we are not alone. That Jesus is in it with us, that God is in it with us, if we want him to be. He is saying, invite Jesus into this battle with you. And I know for a fact from my own life, when we do, he shows up. He shows up. And when we do that, something different starts to happen. Now, it does not mean we don't have struggles. Right? We still have struggles in our lives. But we oftentimes just find the ability to face them, to somehow push through it. Or when you're dealing with a diagnosis or an outcome that you just do not want, you somehow find a peace and ability to get through it. But then sometimes what we find is that thing we tried to break free of so many times in the past, whatever it is, and we tried and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed. But as we invite Jesus into the process, as we invite God into the process, this time we make it, or at least we start to make it, or maybe just make it further than last time. And that's okay. Right? These things that we carry with us are heavy and they are hard. Right? And when you look at issues like chemical dependency, it is not unusual to take try after try. But as people stay in it, as they embrace things like the steps and whatever other supporting programs they might be using, and we embrace this truth that God will be in it with us if we invite him, that's when we can start to find our way to the other side. So a life well lived, or to live our lives well, is built on a few things. It is, of course, working towards purpose, recognizing we have purpose in every step, and embracing that, and accepting that truth that you were built for a purpose. It's often hard to convince ourselves of that. But as we live it out, we start to see it more. But then we also have to recognize that we don't just take time to push through the pain. Or say it better. We don't want to just try to push through the pain. We want to take time to heal from the pain. And don't try to do it alone. Invite God in, but also invite people in. Because big pain is hard to get free of, but it is possible. I will tell you, I know for a fact that it is possible. But you can't do it alone. So if you're carrying trauma or some kind of post-traumatic stress, man, get into a support group. If you've been dealing with relationship issues or toxic relationships, see a counselor. If you've got a chemical dependency, get into a 12-step. And work through it. Work through it with the best of your ability while embracing the presence and power of God and the support of the people you invite into it. And as we reach out to God and as we face our own hurts and we put this kind of work into it, and we are willing to do exactly what we would tell that runner to do, going, I know you want to keep running. I know you do. But just sit down for a minute and heal and clean up and rest and maybe even get a new pair of shoes. You will find the ability to run far more effectively than what you're trying to do right now. And whatever time that we feel like is lost while we're resting and healing, we will more than make up for on the other end. But it starts with being willing to face what we're dealing with, get the support that we need. I encourage you to invite God into that process, and then take the time. It changes everything. And through that, you will change more than you can imagine.